lovely people, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you've just joined us. My name is Nell, and today I thought I would do a bit of different true crime story, but one which is no less interesting and honestly I think quite an important part of history, and one which people may not necessarily know of, or at least know very much of. So I thought I would delve into that story today. Now, I think everyone at some point in their lives has had a job which they have absolutely hated and have gone home from work in the evenings quite often thinking, God, I've got to get out of that job, it's going to kill me. What if you had a job which was quite literally doing that, slowly, from inside out? This is the story of the Radium Girls. So, as always, grab a drink, dim the lights, and let's get into it. So everybody knows that Marie Curie was the one to discover radium, and it was considered a huge scientific breakthrough because they would often use it as a way to get rid of cancerous tumours in cancer patients. So it was hailed as this, huge modern medical marvel. And when it became more readily available to the public in 1902, people just kind of went crazy for it because it was considered this really healthy thing. They put it in absolutely everything. They put it in toothpaste, in children's toys, in all kinds of different things. There were radium lined water bottles that people could use, and if you're really rich, even radium spas. So it was hailed as almost like this hugely important cure-all for anything, and considered really healthy. And at this point, obviously, people didn't understand that much about radium. They knew that it kind of had a glow about it and a faint warmth to it, but other than that, other than being this amazingly wonderful new discovery, not much was really known about it. And unfortunately, that would be a huge deficit to a lot of people in the future. So in 1917, America joined World War I, and as many of the men were off fighting, that left the women at home to do what they could to support the home front, whether that meant working in shops or on farmland or even in factories. And the most popular factory work at the time was doing dial painting, and this was a really sought after job. It paid 3 times more than the average factory work did, and it wasn't a simply one wage or one set wage job. The more work you produced, the more you got paid, which people really liked because it gave them more motivation and incentive to work hard. It was a job that you had to be particularly skilled at, however, because they were using one of the most expensive products on earth at the time. Radium was this incredibly expensive thing. They had to be incredibly skilled with steady hands in order to paint on radium on the dials. In April 1917, a young woman started work at the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey. Her name was Grace Fryer, and she was only 18 at the time. And this was quite a common thing for factory workers. They tended to be either teenagers or young women in their 20s, and they were often employed because they had or tended to have smaller hands. So the smaller your hands were, the easier it would be for you to do the work. And not long before she had started this job, her brothers had gone off to fight in the war, and so Grace kind of wanted to try to do her bit for the war effort. So she became employed at this company to become a dial painter. So the dial painters would come to be nicknamed the Ghost Girls because quite often they would spill a little of radium on themselves, and then walking home in the dark, those spills and stains would show up and glow on their clothes. And quite often the girls would kind of take advantage of this. They would go into work in the factories during the day in their best clothes, favourite dresses and all that, and then even in the evenings they would go out to the dance halls and obviously get a lot of attention because they would get onto the dance floor and they would glow and quite literally light up the room. And some of the girls even took it as far as to actually paint this stuff on their teeth, so when they smiled in the dark their teeth would shine and light up. And at the factories the girls would be shown a special technique that they had to use, which came to be called the lip dip and paint technique, where they would touch the tip of the brush to their lips, dip it in the radium paint, and then paste it onto the dial. And at first they would often ask, you know, are you sure that this is safe? Because obviously no one wants to put something in their mouth that is going to cause them harm. And they were always told by the company, yes, it's perfectly safe to use, don't worry about it, go off and do your job, kind of thing. Now obviously we know that this was very, very far from the truth, and even before then people had died handling radium. Even Marie Curie herself had received radiation burns from it, and the men who worked in the factories actively handling it had to wear special like lead lined aprons and used lead tipped prongs when moving it around for their own safety. The girls, however, weren't afforded such protection because the way that it was seen was they were only using a very small amount, so it wasn't dangerous. The trouble for the Radium Girls really started in 1992 when one of Grace's co-workers, Molly Maggia, went to the dentist with awful toothache, and he had a look in her mouth and he'd extracted the tooth that was giving her trouble and kind of sent her on her way, and she kind of expected the pain to have gone afterwards, but it didn't. And in fact, not only did it carry on, but the wound which had come from the tooth being extracted didn't heal. In fact, it became ulcerated, and even more painful with pus and with blood. And then the tooth next to it started hurting, and the one after that, and the one after that. And she went back to the dentist and he removed those teeth as well, but with the same effect. Those wounds also became ulcerated and painful, and the smell that came from her mouth was horrendous, but there was nothing that she could do about it. And in the end, this spread more and more, and in the end her teeth started falling out by themselves. And not only that, but she began experiencing pain in her arms and her legs, and it got so bad that she could no longer walk. She would often go back to the dentist, and she'd be in just absolute agony, and you know, she was desperate for help. And at one point he reached into her mouth to have a look and just touched at her jaw, and it came away in his hand. Quite literally, her jaw crumbled against his fingertips. By September, this pain, this strange infection, had spread to her throat and her jugular, and she ended up choking on her own blood. She was 24, and on her death certificate they put that it was syphilis, which, to add insult to injury, not only did she die this terrible, terrible death, but then to have it on your death certificate that you died of a sexually transmitted disease, which she was not that kind of girl. She didn't sleep around. You know, it's horrendous. And of course, this is something that the company that she'd worked for, USRC, would use against her in the future. Molly was the first girl to have died this awful death, but she certainly wouldn't be the last. Soon after, other girls started complaining of similar pains and aches, and the company didn't want to know. They weren't interested in what these girls were saying, but in the end they brought in their own company doctor to have a look at them. I say doctor very loosely. He was not a medical doctor, but a doctor of psychology. That's it. They brought in a fake doctor in order to kind of put these rumours to rest and to tell the girls, no, you're absolutely fine, there's nothing wrong with you, you're all healthy as horses, go back and do your job. Which says it all, really, I think. For 2 years, this company absolutely denied claims that what they were using for the doll painting had any kind of connection whatsoever to do with the deaths of these young women. And in the end, in 1924, they actually brought in some independent experts to try to either confirm or deny the fact. But they weren't doing this for the for the sake of their employees and to try to create a safer work environment. Oh no, they did this because they were losing employees and losing interest in people wanting to come and work for them, because, well, who'd want to go and work for a company which had rumours attached to it where people were dying from? No, I certainly wouldn't. And so yeah, they brought in these independent experts to come and have a look around and try to, well, what they hoped would put these rumours to rest. Unfortunately for the company, when the results came back, it was indeed confirmed that there was indeed a link to what they were doing at the factories was resulting in the death of the dial painters. And the head of the company was absolutely furious by this, so much so that he actually paid for new studies to be done which actually said the opposite. And he even went as far as to lie to the Department of Labour, who had also started looking into these rumours and allegations, by saying that the first kind of study that had been done had been inaccurate and wrong. And look, these new studies show that it's all quite clearly perfectly safe. And when the doctors of these girls would come forward to talk to the company to say, look, you know, these girls are really quite sick, will you pay for their medical fees? They said, no, absolutely not. It's nothing to do with us. And so many of these girls had to go without medical help simply because they couldn't afford it. Now, there was this brilliant new doctor called Martland, and he had obviously heard about what was going on at the factories and all the rumours spreading around them, and he was quite sure that there was absolutely some sort of link between the two. The only issue, of course, was being able to prove that, because at the time, you know, radium was considered incredibly healthy and this cure-all. So, you know, trying to convince anyone otherwise of this would be incredibly hard. And then came his first big breakthrough, when on the 7th of June 1925, a male employee of the company, Dr. Lehman, actually died. And this was when the company actually started paying attention. Never mind all these young women dying from the company. One male dies and all of a sudden they want to take action and you know, give it their full attention, which really just kind of goes to show the amount of sexism involved in this kind of age. Dr. Lehman was the first person to have been given an autopsy with the suspicion of it being something connected to the radium. And upon first look, with all the chemical analysis, nothing was really discovered. And so Harrison Martland went back to the company and asked if he could use the factory space to kind of conduct some more tests on this. And surprisingly, the company says, yes, you can, but as long as you don't like give out the results of it to anyone, you know, you need to keep it a secret. So House and Martland incinerated the body of Dr. Lehman and kind of turned his bones to dust, and then he tested them with an instrument called an electrometer, and the results and the recordings he got from it went through the roof for radioactivity. This was the kind of evidence that House and Martland needed to show that, yes, this company was absolutely killing its workers by using this radium substance. But he needed more evidence and proof. So he went to the hospital and he met with two sisters called Marguerite Carlo and Sarah Malaffer. Now, both of these sisters were suffering with the same kind of symptoms that the previous girls had been, and they had agreed to undergo a series of tests by him to determine whether this was indeed radium poisoning. Using a gamma ray test and expired air method, he was able to determine that, yes, indeed, the amount of radium in their bodies was significant. In fact, I'd probably go as far to say that it was off the charts entirely. And unfortunately, Sarah, after this, died about a week later, and Marguerite not too long after that. And the autopsy between the two sisters showed that there had been such a constant amount of radium in their bodies that their bones had just become like honeycomb. They were so brittle and so dry that they were literally just disintegrating, basically. Now, just to be clear just how powerful radium is, radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, which means that the bones and the remains of these girls, they're still radioactive to this day, and they will be in our children's time and great-grandchildren's time, and maybe even our great-great-grandchildren's time. And that's just, it's mind-blowing. It really, really is. So on the one hand, they had this proof that, yes, absolutely, radium was harmful. On the other hand, there was no cure, and these girls knew that it would only be a matter of time before it did eventually kill them. And knowing that must have been awful, because these girls were so young. You know, they were in their early to mid-20s. Many of them had, you know, recently got married and or had young children, or were just starting to start their own families, and you know, they had all these dreams for the future, and knowing that that would have been wiped away, it's horrendous. So by this point, there was really only one thing the girls could do, and that was to sue the company for what they were doing to them. And Grace Trier was the first one to do this. Now, by this time, she was really very, very sick. She had to wear a back brace all the time because her spine was so weak, it was practically disintegrating. And she's just in pain constantly, as were many of the other girls. But they knew that they had to do what they could to try to help. And they knew that, they only had a short time left. It was too late for them, but they would do what they could for the future to make sure that this didn't happen to anybody else. Now, they had this massive challenge of trying to find someone to take on their case and represent them in court, because no one wanted to do it. No one wanted to go up against this massive company. It was much too high a risk, and they really struggled with this for a long time, until a lawyer called Raymond Berry agreed to take the case on in 1927. Now, as well as Grace Fryer, he also agreed to take on the cases of Catherine Schweb, Edna Hustman, Albina Lorry and Juanita MacDonald. And the last two were actually the sisters of Molly Maguire, who had been the first girl to have succumbed to this awful disease. And they too were also suffering from it, because so often, girls would go into this trade and they would bring in friends and family to do it as well. And so you'd get whole families of women doing the doll painting, and a few years later, all of them succumbing to this radiation poisoning. So during the court trials, the company really kind of gave back as good as they got. They claimed that the symptoms that the girls were having were kind of too varied and too different to be linked to the radiation poisoning, as well as the fact that at the time radiation poisoning wasn't a recognised disease, which at the time it simply wasn't, and they absolutely refused to compensate the girls for what was happening to them. Now, they did eventually agree to settle outside of the court, and the girls were paid about $10,000 each, which, I mean, knowing what they went through and the fact that that amount of money wouldn't have even scratched the surface of the kind of medical bills that they would have accumulated in this time, it feels like nothing, but the girls were happy because they'd really kind of gotten what they'd come for, in the fact of they wanted to kind of draw attention to this radiation poisoning, which they managed to do. And although it took a while after this, it did eventually lead to improvements in the factories. Now, fortunately, in the 1930s, news spread slower than it does today. So while all this was going on in New Jersey, there was a lot of other factories all across the rest of the country who, whose workers had absolutely no idea that this was going on, and they had also no idea just how dangerous this radium was, and so they were still continuing to use it, not thinking anything of it. So in the 1930s, a dial painter by the name of Catherine Donahue, she found that she'd developed a tumour on her hip, about the kind of the size of a grapefruit. Now, beforehand, she had no way of knowing what was going on in New Jersey, like many of the others. But when she heard about the fight that Grace and the other girls had put on, she decided to fight as well. Now, like so many of the other girls, she was in a lot of pain. Like I said, there was a huge tumour on her hip and her jaw was beginning to disintegrate as well. And not only that, but this was at the start of the Great Depression. You know, America was not doing well, and radium was the only kind of main thing that was really kind of trying to keep the economy afloat. And so when she decided to go up against them, you know, she was obviously met with a lot of resistance, and she was not popular in the slightest. But she continued to fight for it. And like Grace, she knew that, you know, her time on this earth was limited, but she wanted to try to do her bit to help others. And in the end, a lawyer called Leonard Grossman agreed to work pro bono for her. And they went to court many times and they were rejected over and over and over again. No one wanted to touch this with a barge pole. And in the end, they ended up appealing their case 8 times before they actually won the lawsuit in 1939. And my goodness, I have so much respect for her and the other girls, because she gave evidence of this malpractice and what the company were doing on her deathbed against her doctor's orders. You know, she was so adamant of helping, you know, the future factory workers that, yeah, instead of resting and basically, you know, spending what little time she had left with her loved ones and her family, she fought pretty much to her last breath. And I find that absolutely incredible. What those girls went through was absolutely horrendous, but what an amazing legacy they've left behind. Thanks to them, we now have life-saving regulations right across the factory board. And not just that, but it's also led to the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in America, which I believe is still here today. Everything we know about radium and radium in the body is thanks to these girls. And it's hard to believe that if we were to walk over the graves today with a Geiger counter, it would still pick up radioactivity from deep underground in lead-lined coffins. Apparently, years after Molly Maggia died, her family dug her up and her bones still glowed. And the idea that that would still be the case today, it's incredible and terrifying. I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as someone can enjoy a video about bodies disintegrating, I suppose. If you enjoyed, then by all means make sure you like, comment and subscribe, and hit that notification bell to be kept up to date when I bring out new content. Until then, stay safe and sweet dreams.